making good progress on my Austin there, but I've also started trying to make some more progress on the Riley, which is buried under a pile of junk here. So there's a number of things I need to do on this that are all starting to come together now. I have some parts coming from the UK, which will hopefully be here in a week or two, including the other mounting bracket that's like this. This is the near side engine and suspension mounting bracket that goes inside the chassis rail there, that the engine sits on and the rear of the front spring attaches to. And there's a similar bracket that goes on the offside of the car here. But this bracket also has the added complication that it's also the bracket for the steering box. This was like a hack 3D printed version I made just to get some idea of what it would look like. I did the same for this one before I got that. That was actually my best guess 3D printed version of what this bracket should be like. And it actually came out pretty close. This was all just from photographs and measurements. And it isn't far off. So it'll be interesting to see how this one comes out. But this one is vital because that gives you the position of the steering box. And the box basically clamps into there. So once that arrives, I can bolt both of those into the chassis. The position of those will be set by effectively the rear gearbox mount, which you can't see where that'll go. There's a cross member under here, and there's a mounting on the back of the gearbox, and that'll set the position of where the engine is in relation to the chassis rails, which will set where I need to attach those brackets here for the engine to sit in the right place. So that's all on the way, as well as some other suspension shackles and some other nice bits and pieces, including a magnesium Brooklyn style engine sump, which would be pretty nice. I do need to do the stub axle still. This is the front axle. The kingpins go through there, obviously. And then the stub axles are up here. What I need to do with these is put in the new bushes. That's what these are. This is the top bush. So if the stub axle goes that way, this is the top. This bush gets pushed through into there. And then the lower bush, which is blind, which can causes a little bit of a problem, gets pushed into the bottom there. So the trick with this is the kingpin, and the kingpin obviously goes through, it's a tight fit, goes through the axle line like that. There's a cotter that holds it, and the stub axle swivels on this. So what you need to do is ream these out in line, and I do have a reamer to do that. This is a 7/8 inch parallel reamer, and it gets a little bit tricky because this is blind, this bottom bush. You can't go all the way through it, and a reamer like this has a lead-in on it, so the diameter here at the bottom is slightly less than the actual diameter of the reamer further up. So I think the way I'm going to do this is insert the top bush, and I'll make a sort of loose collar that fits in here that'll allow me to ream through with this loose collar guiding the reamer, so I can ream through the top bush. Then I can push the bottom bush in place, and I can ream through from the other direction using the top bush as a guide. That's going to leave the bottom of this tight because of the taper on this reamer. So I'm going to have to hand fettle that, and the way you do that is you make up a steel bar with a slot in the end. It'll be similar to this, but it's smaller. This is actually the bar I use for bending up the edges of steel panels. But I'll make up a similar bar, smaller diameter, with a slot in it, and you use a piece of emery paper in the end of the slot that can sort of flap around inside the the bottom of this bush here, and then using a drill you can use that to very carefully sand down the bottom edge of that bush until the kingpin is a nice sliding fit into it. That's the theory anyway. So I've got the reamer. That's quite huge. To be able to use the reamer, I had to actually buy a new tap handle. This was a fairly large one that I had to get to fit onto that. But you need to use something like this because you need to ream through very accurately. So you need it to be two-handed so you can put even pressure on it. So that's one of the jobs I want to do. I also got some parts back. So this is the flywheel, which has been lightened. You can see where it's been machined on the edge and on the back there. And that's taken quite a bit off it. So the flywheel to start with was 12.5 kg. After machining, it's down to 10 kg. So that's lightened it a fair amount. I've also got my shortened steering column back. So this has been shortened about 5 inches. If you put this one in the car, it's just far too long. And it sits too far back. So this has all been done by an engineer. I didn't do this myself. He's shortened it for me. And I'm about to start reassembling it, which is why I've got the second one I've got here out so I can remember how it all goes back together. And this is a separate piece here. There's a thrust bearing in here. That's what this is. And a sort of collar that's sitting on. Then there's another bearing here, and then the main gear on the bottom. And this is a really tight fit. It's not tapered at all, you can see, but it is keyed. So at the moment, that ticking you can hear is those parts inside my little toaster oven to heat them up, which will make them expand, and then I should be able to, if I'm quick, push those on and get those in place. This thing goes up the inside of the column. Now, when the engineer guy fixed it for me, he sleeved the inside of this to make it stronger. And this kind of shows the importance of when you're getting stuff like this done and you're taking it to an engineer to machine it up for you, make sure they have all of the parts, even if they're not going to touch all of them, so that they can see how the whole assembly goes together. Because what we have is, these are the control rods for the manual advance and the hand throttle, I believe. And these have to fit down inside this column. So this hasn't been shortened yet, but I can do that myself. Now the sleeve he put inside here was 1/2 inch diameter, and that's the same as what this inner column is. But it was just fractionally too tight. So I did ream that out to 1/2 inch, which is what it was. And then to get the column to slide all the way in, I actually had to put this in my own lathe and just take a skim off here, just to get it to slide all the way through. Those are my parts done. I'll just put those on for a little bit longer. And you can see this column, it has these really cool little copper things that rotate, that keep the shaft centralized inside here. Both the outer and the inner have those. It's all really high quality stuff. So the shaft, now that I just took a skim off the bottom here, slides all the way through here, and I won't shorten it until I've got things in the car and I know where I need to cut these off. There seems to be a little, you probably can't see it, but right in the end here there's a little brass bush. So once I cut this, I'll probably have to replace that bush. And that just stops that inner column rattling around. So this is the steering box housing. You can sort of see how that there's a groove there that collar matches up into. And this is all adjustable to set up the right sort of meshing between the two gears here. So I'll go ahead and start reassembling all of that. Oh, that's one interesting thing. This is for the Austin with the little screws that I'm using to bolt the metalwork to the guards and the guards to the body are these gutter bolts. These are actually Whitworth thread gutter bolts, and I ran out of the nuts. I think I mentioned in the last video I ran out of these, and I want to make some of these captive on the panels that I just made. So I needed to get more of these. Now, Bunnings and places like that sell these things. I think it's about $6 for a packet of 8 nuts and bolts. I had a look around, and I found a company up in Auckland that had them, and it was $6 for 100 of them. So it just shows that it pays to shop around a little bit. Interestingly, it's very difficult to get BSW nuts and bolts, at least at a reasonable price. So one of the things I'm going to need to do is, back to these brackets again, these originally would have been riveted to the car, I believe, but I'm going to bolt them on with high tensile bolts, and I want to use BSF bolts. And since the company that I got these off were really good, I asked if they could get them, and they did manage to source some locally. And I'm looking at 5/8 bolts, which is about an 8mm bolt, about an inch long or an inch and a quarter, which will be enough to bolt this to the body. All high tensile, of course, so you can't just use cheap hardware store type bolts. And the local company wanted New Zealand dollars, $11.90 per bolt, and $3 for each nut, and that's for one nut and bolt. So I don't think I'll be getting those locally. I know we're supposed to be supporting local manufacturers and that kind of thing, but that's just ridiculous. So I think I can get the nuts and bolts from the UK for about $3 for the nut and bolt pair, which is still expensive, and I'm going to have to pay for shipping, but it's a lot better than $15 for a nut and bolt. So that's another thing I need to order. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get this steering column reassembled. Have the steering box back together now. It took me 2 goes actually, because the first time I reassembled it, I couldn't get it to fit back in the housing correctly, and the problem turned out to be the thrust bearing, which was preventing this bearing from going fully into this housing. This is on the one I didn't completely strip down, and you can see how this works. That's the housing that this big bearing slides into, and there's a thrust bearing here, and there's actually a collar. It's like a top hat shaped collar that goes on the shaft here, and that's what this thrust bearing pushes up against. And there's a step on this collar. You can just sort of see it in there. What was happening was, the way I had it assembled in this one, the one side of the thrust bearing wasn't seating fully home like that. So I had to strip it all down again, which required more heat, and it's quite hard to pull them apart. And found that if I turned these 2 thrust bearing pieces around, it all fitted back together normally. So that's what I had to do. I had to flip around that thrust bearing and reassemble it. When I've reassembled it, I've used Loctite on all the shafts. I've used the bearing fit stuff, and I've also used Loctite on the thread. This gear is keyed to the shaft as well, and everything's done up incredibly tight, so there's no way this can come undone. Interestingly, on the Austin 7s, I can't remember exactly how it works, but it's a similar sort of steering box. But the gear on the end of the shaft, I think it's sort of a press fit and sort of staked on. I'm not exactly sure, but I have heard of those coming loose. Obviously, if this gear comes loose from the shaft, you lose all your steering. So these definitely seem to be engineered so that there's no way this can come loose or come off. So everything on there is really tight. I've also reassembled the top end, which I believe goes like this. This seems to be the most sensible way for it to go back together. There's another thrust bearing inside here, and there is no end play on this at all. Nothing's oiled at the moment, but you can see if I turn that turns the gear there. So I believe that's all correct. This will need to be all reassembled and bolted back together. I'm not sure exactly what sort of grease is best to use in here. I will take apart the top end and put some good grease in there, but probably I'll end up using the Penrite steering box oil in here, which is the same stuff I used in the Austin 7. So it's kind of it's a bit like grease and oil. The good thing about it is it won't migrate up the steering columns, which is what it does on Austin 7s. So I think this is good now. This is all complete.